everyone. I am Josh Moore. I'm from the Student Press Law Center. And we really want to thank you for joining us for this annual op-ed workshop. It's an opportunity to learn about how to write and pitch op-eds, editorials, and other advocacy. And we're really excited that you're here with us tonight. We host this event each year just ahead of Student Press Freedom Day in hopes that you'll use what you learn here to advocate for student journalism and press freedom in the coming weeks. Student Press Freedom Day is actually coming up this February 27th. It's our 8th annual Student Press Freedom Day. And it's an annual opportunity to raise awareness about the issues student journalists face and to take steps to defend and advance their rights. And of course, part of that includes written advocacy like op-eds. And on the screen you see there is our website, studentpressfreedom.org, where you can learn more about Student Press Freedom Day and how you can get involved. And if you share anything on social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag #StudentPressFreedom so that we can find and amplify what you share. So Student Press Freedom Day is organized each year by the Student Press Law Center. And we have some tremendous sponsors who make it all possible through their support of student journalism. So we want to thank our sponsors this year. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Student Press Law Center, we are a nonprofit that provides free legal help, information, and training to student journalists and advisors throughout the country. We're actually the only legal nonprofit in the US, and to my knowledge, in the whole world, actually, that's specifically focused on protecting the legal rights of student journalists. And the most important tool that you should probably know about for SPLC is our free legal hotline, and the address is there on your screen. This is where you can speak directly to one of our attorneys if you have questions about censorship or public records, copyright, pretty much anything news gathering related in the course of your student journalism. We also have lots of legal guides and resources on our website, so you can be sure to check those things out too at splc.org. So with all of that intro stuff out of the way, I want to introduce you to our speaker tonight, Pratika Katiyar. Pratika is a Gen Z journalist and advocate with op-eds published in CNN, Her Campus, the Sacramento Bee, and several other places. And last year, she was actually named to Her Campus's 22 Under 22 list of inspiring women. She's been an advocate for student journalism since high school, so I'm really excited that we get to learn from Pratika tonight. So Pratika, I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh, for the introduction. I've been involved with the Student Press Law Center for several years now, and it's a fabulous organization. So I definitely recommend getting involved, whether you choose to write an op-ed or in some of the other ways that are listed in later slides, and also what Josh just talked about. I was a former SPLC board member, but I also have used op-eds as a way to do a lot of advocacy for student press freedom, for free speech, and for just broader issues that I'm really passionate about beyond free speech and student press freedom. I have my contact information listed, but I will also give it out at the end if you do choose to write an op-ed and you would like a pair of eyes on it, or maybe just some pointers on what you can do with that, or what you can do with SPLC and how to get involved with advocacy. So just to kind of kick things off, if you've drafted an op-ed before, or maybe if you haven't, just kind of throw it in the chat. I want to see just everyone's familiarity with it. I'm obviously going to go through everything, but I want to hear from everyone about, their experiences. And, even beyond op-ed, just throw in the chat if you're a student journalist, or any involvement you have with student journalism. So I'll give you a few moments. Okay. Um, oh, cool. So seeing some people who are familiar with journalism. Um, and then, oh, yay. Okay, lots of people familiar with op-eds. That's really great. So this shouldn't be like a foreign language or anything. But we're gonna dive into kind of what makes a really great op-ed. And then, as you're thinking about this is kind of a question. that you're welcome to throw in the chat or just kind of think about like why are you interested in writing an op-ed? Are you going to write about student press freedom? Are you writing about something related to your school? Is there a broader issue that you care about? Thinking about, what's motivating you right now to be a part of this workshop and to want to draft an op-ed, or at least learn how to draft an op-ed. I'm seeing a lot of people saying they're student journalists, or familiar with op-eds. That's super, super exciting and encouraging. So diving into this, we're going to start out with key terms. Um, I see that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these, but I always like to start out as if I don't know anything or the audience might not be familiar. So some key terms include op-ed, which is opinion editorial, typically 700 to 800 words, but they can range to like 600 to 1,000 words even. That's on the higher side, depending on, what you're writing about. Is it more personal? Is it taking an essay format or like a short, succinct kind of like pointed format? So that's kind of the range, but it's usually pretty short compared to maybe like a investigative piece or a full-length feature piece. A lead, so that's the hook or the intro of the article, and it's really intended to captivate the reader. So in comparison to a news article, your op-ed lead should be something that makes me want to read your opinion. Why should I care about what you're about to write about? This isn't like breaking news. It's not necessarily, um, an issue that I might know a lot about or that's in the headlines as much. So the lead is really what's going to draw your reader in. The nut graph is then a paragraph that explains the main idea of the article. And this is really key in op-eds because you should be able to succinctly kind of say what the point of your op-ed is or what the thesis is. Um, Pitch, that's like a short email to an editor of a publication for when you're done with your op-ed and you want to pitch it to a news outlet. This is like an elevator pitch or a pitch for some type of like entrepreneurial pursuit. It's very similar, but in writing and to an editor so that you can kind of sell why your story and why your op-ed is a good fit for the news outlet and just for the time that it's being published. And then coverage, that is uh, the amount and the quality of reporting that's given to a particular event or a story. I kind of threw that in there because I've done more general op-ed workshops before where maybe not everything was about kind of student press freedom or student journalism. And it was about topics that people didn't actually know a lot about. So like things related to like technology and privacy, that was something I've done in the past. And so looking at coverage and seeing whether or not it's been published in the past or something similar has been published before gives you a good understanding of what the prospects for your own op-ed might look like. So why write an op-ed? This is kind of like, I don't know, this is kind of like a personal thing. It's very much like whether or not you feel comfortable having your opinion out there, but to encourage all of you, I think that op-eds are a powerful tool for advocacy. They're very public facing. They reach a broader audience. They reach people that may not otherwise be engaged with your writing, your newsroom, or the issue that you're writing about. They can be very compelling and very actionable, more so than like academic writing. Depending on if you're like in high school or college, like you'll take these courses that have you write more long form pieces with theses that are very academic. You're using a lot of like citations. Not that you don't use them in op-eds, but they're very dense, very like they read like a book almost. And op-eds are simple. They're good for an audience to become familiar with an issue, to learn about your opinion, to learn about the point you're trying to make in very short amount of words and in very plain language, but that's very powerful. So it turns these potentially complex ideas into these narratives that are easy to digest. And they can incite conversation and change. I have some examples lined up throughout this presentation about very powerful pieces of op-eds that I've found. that have led to changes in policy or changes to lawmakers' minds or to an organization. So they can do a lot depending on who's the audience and where it's being placed. So questions to ask yourself before writing an op-ed or while you're writing an op-ed. Do I have a clear point to make? What is my point or what is my thesis? Who cares and who's going to be reading it? And is there substance to my argument? I think these are really good questions just before and during your writing process to ask yourself because you want to make sure that you have a single sentence that you can distill what you want to write into. Like, for example, if I were to write about student press freedom, I would say my thesis would be something along the lines of um, given today's political climate, student journalists deserve the same amount of protections as professional journalists because of the nature of work that they're doing to fill in local news gaps. That's actually a little bit wordy, but if I had time to refine that, I would make that my central idea, and that's my point I'm trying to make in my op-ed. So you want to kind of think of one sentence, one overarching central point your op-ed is going to make, and put your arguments kind of around that. And I'm going to talk about structure a little bit later, but these are some key questions to ask yourself as well. So, what makes an op-ed effective? I'm going to go back really quickly and just go to the fourth point and the third point about who's reading your op-ed and like who cares and what substance there is. Those are all things that, if you tailor your op-ed, as in you tailor it to the audience, you think about who's going to be reading it, and you think about the points you have to support your argument. Those are all really important details that make your op-ed even more effective. There's differences between good op-eds and great op-eds. I think good op-eds are ones that make really good points. They're very valid. They have evidence to support their thesis. I think great op-eds are ones that keep in mind who their audience is. Are you writing for your school paper? If you're writing for your school paper, chances are your peers and your teachers are your audience. If you're writing for a local outlet, let's say I'm from Virginia, so I'm gonna like use the Richmond Times as an example. If you're writing for the Richmond Times, your audience is people across Virginia and especially in Richmond. So it's people of all ages, generally an older demographic, and generally a local demographic. So they're more familiar with what's going on in Virginia. So that's kind of what distinguishes good versus great, in my opinion. Going into other factors that make op-eds really effective, timeliness, that's a huge one. You want your op-ed, they don't always have to be pegged to like the news or what's going on in the world, but they will be great if you can connect it to something that's ongoing and more likely to get published if you have a news hook or some type of peg to a big event going on. Um, so, for example, this past year on college campuses, protests were taking over all types of colleges and universities across the country. That's a really important news hook because even mainstream and national news outlets were covering the protests. And so, if you were a student journalist writing an op-ed about something related to maybe press freedom, you could use examples of for example, student journalists being arrested at a protest as a hook to your op-ed. So looking at really what's going on and what the national news is interested in covering as well, I think will help with the timeliness factor. So my first example is actually from something I wrote several years ago, over 4 years ago now. And this is actually in the Richmond Times, which is really funny. Um, and it was right after the January 6th incident in 2021. So I wrote about kind of a very not like I didn't the whole piece isn't about January 6th at all, but I used the event as a hook to talk about press freedom because that was kind of something that was discussed um around that time was like attacks on media, attacks on news people, and just like press freedom in general for professional journalists. And I used that to talk about First Amendment protections for student journalists. So I think that's a really important like this is an example that I put in here because I think it's really important to show that like I didn't use that to talk like throughout the whole op-ed. It wasn't about January 6th at all. It was just a segue to my main point. Um, I have a really recent example that I thought did pretty well from USA Today. So it's about, if anyone's keeping up with the news, a Chinese artificial intelligence company just released an AI model that's super similar to ChatGPT, and it basically uses this event of them releasing the AI model to then talk about like what the future of AI might look like in the US, and just more broadly how US companies can compete with like DeepSeek, which is the model name. So I think that's super interesting. It's using this news event and writing an op-ed about it. And this one is more of an example of like actually following the news and having your op-ed be about a news event or something recent that just happened. So these are two different examples. One is like using current events to then talk about something that's relevant but not necessarily that current event. And the second example with the AI example is more like using the news event to talk about or share your opinion or your point relevant to the news. If that's a little confusing, please like drop a question. But I really want to emphasize that timeliness I think is super important. And I gave that example of protests. I think there's a lot of other really good examples out there when you think of stuff that's also just happening on your high school or college campus. So think of events happening in your local community too that you can then tie your op-ed to. So maybe there's a bill going being in consideration for maybe student press freedom in your legislature, in your state legislature. That's a timely news event that you can then peg your op-ed to. So, in terms of other effective factors, I think having a unique perspective is really, really important because you have to be somewhat establishing yourself as an expert and being the best person to write the op-ed. And I don't mean to say that you need to be like the president to write an amazing op-ed. You as a student have power in your voice, and students are the best source of news for their own community, and that's an expert in and of itself. I mean, all students have the best idea and the pulse on what's going on their campus, and you leverage that perspective to turn into an op-ed. So I have a few headlines here that I'm going to just touch upon and talk about why they were the best to write about this. For example, this one is a New York Times one, and it's super obvious, I think, at least to me. It's pretty evident why. Hillary Clinton is the best person to write about this topic, and it's the presidential debates. She talks about having debated both Trump and Biden. That's a very unique experience. It's a unique perspective. Not many people or anyone actually, um, I might be wrong about that, can really like have that perspective. So that's a very like high level example. But one that I really like is actually from my own university. I went to Northeastern University in Boston, and this is an op-ed that was in our school paper about how Northeastern switched mental health providers, and they talk about almost losing their therapist. That's a very interesting perspective because students are, taking advantage of resources on campus. You're in classes, you interact with faculty, you're in clubs, you're in a lot of different parts of the campus community. And that's in and of itself a very unique perspective. You might be interacting, for example, the student was taking advantage of our university's mental health resources. You might be in that similar position where you're, um, for example, you're in your student news outlet and you want to write about issues with the administration, and you have that unique perspective because you've been a staff writer for so many years dealing with all these stories you've written trying to get through administrative approval. So really thinking about your own role on your campus, that's a unique perspective. Like I said, you don't have to be like Hillary Clinton to have that expertise. You just need to think about why you're the best person to be able to have this opinion and this point that you're making in your op-ed. The last example, this one is kind of an interesting one. It's if anyone's like an NFL fan, I did a whole presentation about the politics of the NFL for one of my classes in college, but there was a whole issue with Colin Kaepernick, and the former NFL, I think, head of communications, I might be wrong about their title, but they were formerly affiliated with the NFL, came out in 2020 to write about why Colin Kaepernick should be signed. Now, that's a really interesting perspective. It's someone who previously worked with an organization coming out to then talk about what that organization should be doing at a very high level, important, timely moment. Um, so that was just kind of like one that I like really liked. I just thought it was interesting that someone is using their position of power or their old position of power to then write about ways to make it better. So that was also just a really unique perspective that I don't think we always see. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's just so many ways. And so I encourage you to think about the ways in which you're an expert on your own campus community or on the issues that maybe you're working on. So maybe you, um, for example, like are very passionate about reproductive health. And maybe you have been working on that as an issue for several years as a student organizer. That's an expertise, that's a unique position that you should be able to leverage. So, really just thinking about that and being introspective about where you fit in your op-ed, I think can also add a lot of personality to the piece. You don't want to just be another piece that's echoing similar points that have already been made. You want to add to the discourse and kind of expand on it by adding your own personality and your own unique voice to it. So going into other things that make it effective, I want to start with kind of the lead. That's, where we're jumping in, that's where we're hooking our readers. Provocative leads are so, so important. Um, this one, I apologize, is just a little bit like intense, and I wouldn't have included it if I didn't think it was just so good at hooking readers in. But this one is kind of about it's in the Boston Globe. It's about gentrification in Boston's neighborhoods and historically Black neighborhoods, and like um, more specifically talking about this place called the Murder Triangle in Boston. Um, so I'll give a moment to just let everyone read this. Awesome. So I think what really drew me in when I was reading this was just like the staccato lead was it was three different incidents that just pull you in. You're wondering what's going on, and then you get to the end and you kind of see what the article is shaping up to be. But the beginning is what hooks you. It's giving three separate incidents. It's very short, it's to the point. And I just loved the way it was written, and I thought it was very provocative. It 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 evokes emotion in people. It gives them a reason to keep reading. It gets them interested. And if you're in the community, this was in the Boston Globe, so thinking of their audience, people in Boston, I think, would have even more of a connection because they're part of these communities and they're reading about them and they're reading about these horrible incidents that are happening. Um, so I really like this lead. And I'm gonna dive into another one as well. This one's a bit like intense, so I don't know if anyone's stories are gonna be this intense. But it's just even just thinking of the writing style, I love to like read other op-eds to just get better understanding of like what type of writing style I could use. So this is one that I wrote and it was in CNN, and I wrote about student press freedom and just more broadly like campus free speech at a very like tumultuous time for education and speech on campuses. Um, so I start out with quoting a Supreme Court opinion and then end it with this kind of like almost like zinger, which is like, oh, like this is a great Supreme Court opinion, but if only it could actually be true. Um, and I use that to put that into the context of free speech, and I use that to kind of dive into my central point. But it's interesting because, like, quotes, I think we tend not to use in like feature or news writing as like our hooks, maybe in features, but definitely not news. Like news is very straight to the point. This happened at this time at this location. But here I'm using this quote from a Supreme Court case and really just using that to then almost give commentary on it. Um, this is kind of interesting in the sense that it's not like as intense as the previous one, but it's in its own way like witty, sarcastic. And I spent a lot of time workshopping the lead. I was thinking of, what are some ways that I can write about student press freedom in a unique way? I've written about it so many times that at this point, when I was writing this piece, I was like, okay, what can I do that's different? And it was really to use other instances of free speech and give commentary on that. So I encourage you to kind of think of ways that you can write provocative leads, whether that's using an anecdote. I'm a big fan of like using one story and like kind of diving into that one story. I've done that a lot for academic papers and in journalism. Another really interesting way you can do it is like the staccato lead. So maybe if you had three instances of censorship on your campus, you can use that to build up the tension into the lead and then into your point. Um, or you can draw inspiration. So, for example, like I used a Supreme Court case here as my lead. You can use something that, someone has said, a politician has said, a lawmaker, even quoting from a bill that maybe you're writing about, and then and inserting your own voice into that to kind of evoke emotion or draw the reader in. I think this is the last part of kind of what makes an effective op-ed, and then I'm going to go into structure, but call to action, and this is so, so, so important. It's really critical because op-eds are meant to encourage people to take action. They're meant to have people wanting to go and call their lawmakers or wanting to go and get involved or wanting to know more about the issue. That's why I love op-eds as a form of journalism because they are a vehicle for advocacy and they're really anyone can write one. You don't have to be a journalist to write an op-ed. And oftentimes you'll see politicians write them because they know that this is a way to get their audience aware of these issues or the issue that they're writing about and wanting them to do something. Op-eds are the best way to energize people into doing and listening to your voice and doing what you maybe want them to do. So the call to action is so important. You have to be prescriptive. Um, and when I say be prescriptive, that means using words in your writing like urge, demand, insist, really strong language. You don't want to be like meek. You want to say, I urge you to call your lawmaker, or I demand that this bill get passed. You want to show that there's strength in your opinion and you want to stand firm in your points of view. This is an op-ed from my student newspaper in college, actually published a few months ago, right before the election. And I really liked this as a call to action because um, I think it's very prescriptive. Especially, I want to look at the second graph. It says, we all have a choice this election season. We can stand by and watch a historic election take place without our input, or we can stand with history and vote. It is your choice, but remember how important voting was for your ancestors. And then it continues and talking about, and it ends with, it is up to you. I just think the language is so strong. The point of this op-ed, as I'm sure you can get also just from these graphs, is it was telling college students to vote. There's historically, depending on different time periods, it's been hard and challenging to get young people out to vote and to get college students, especially registered to vote. So this op-ed from a few months ago was really trying to hone in on like, you need to go and vote point. Now that's just one call to action, but I thought it did it really well. It used emotion, it used really strong language to kind of want to make you go and vote and say like you have this choice, but this is what the right choice is in the author's perspective. Um, so that was like kind of one that I really liked, that I was reading a few months ago in my school paper. You want to give concrete steps. So when it comes to student press freedom, this is from the same CNN article that I wrote op-ed that I wrote about press freedom, you want to give these concrete steps. So when you talk about new voices, for example, email your legislator, donate to your school paper, your college paper. I don't think high school papers, depending on the high school. Anyways, I think mainly college papers are the ones that like solicit donations, but donate to your college paper. That's a way to prevent administrative censorship and encourage your newsroom to go independent. Learn more at splc.org, or write to your administration asking them to support student journalism. Write to your administration asking them to reconsider their rules about prior review or censorship. There's a lot of concrete steps when it comes to student press freedom, and also just more broadly, like any issue that you're talking about. Maybe you're talking about a bill in Congress. Write to your legislator to support the bill or not support the bill. The call to action, I think there's a lot of ways you can do it, but it is the most important part to conclude your op-ed. What I wrote here, this was in CNN, was to tell educators and professional journalists to be allies, to persuade lawmakers as well, to encourage student journalists. So instead of just saying like, oh, like I think, student journalists can do XYZ, I'm also drawing in the other demographics that are stakeholders in the issue. So I'm saying like educators, professional journalists, and then I'm also talking to students and saying, show up to school board meetings, advocate for stories to be published without fear of censorship or against the fear of censorship. Um, so I'm really engaging all the stakeholders that are involved in the issue. I think that's super important. And I think that's really good for the audience to have clear, concrete takeaways from what they read. So anyone can write an opinion and have it put out there. We see opinions all the time on social media, but op-eds are so important because they have that call to action. And especially when you're thinking of an issue like student press freedom, op-eds are so important because there are steps you can take to advocate for strong student press freedom protections. So that's kind of something that I urge you to think about is, what is your call to action? You can have a great thesis, you can have a great point, great argument, but you want to have someone take away something from your writing and, close their phone or whatever they're reading on and be like, oh, well, like, this is really interesting. I think I'm going to go here and learn more about it. So that's kind of, something that's really key to an op-ed and an effective one, especially. So the general structure and format for op-eds, like I said, 600 to 800 words is optimal, unless you know you're writing for like a specific outlet already, and they have like a specific structure, but generally like 600 to 800 words. Short paragraphs. So I think, I saw a lot of people were already familiar with journalism. We don't really write long paragraphs in journalism. It's not academic writing. It's succinct to the point, very engaging, and in almost like 2 to 3 sentences, you have a point in every paragraph. So short paragraphs, um, hyperlink to every statistic, every fact, any outside research you do, you have to hyperlink it. No citations, but hyperlinking is your way of doing citations. And that's really crucial because if you're publishing with a news outlet, they will need you to fact check and they will fact check as well. So it's good to have all your sources backed up. And I think good op-eds do include statistics. For example, the one that I wrote with CNN, I talked about how over 10% of state house reporters are college journalists. And I used Pew Research Center to find that statistic and I backed it up and I hyperlinked it in my story. So, including statistics to as evidence for your thesis and hyperlinking, really important, really crucial for the general structure of the op-ed. Um, in terms of the headline, the editor will always like, I don't want to say always, actually. Most of the time, the editor will write the headline, or tinker with one that you came up with, but don't worry. So that's a way of saying like, don't worry too much about the headline because the editor, that's their kind of role in when they publish it, they will come up with the headline. And so you really just want to make sure you're focusing on the content of the op-ed. reading, I think, makes you a better writer, and I know that's, like, very cliche, but I read so many op-eds before I kind of thought about the way I wanted to write one. Um, Beyond the New York Times, like, reading local ones, so, like, I read a lot of, like, Boston Globe ones when I was taking journalism classes in college. Also, like, if you're really interested in a specific topic, so, like, if you really like tech, for example, like Wired, they have really good op-eds. They have an ideas section, I think. Um, Also The Atlantic does like more story, like more personal ones. I think the New Yorker does too. They do like more personal identity-based ones. So really depending on what you're interested in, I think reading will make you a better op-ed writer and help you discover your own voice. So at the bottom, I have like what the general like structure should look like. So it's lead, your thesis, and then your nut graph, your arguments. That will probably be like at least 2 to 3 like sub points to back up your thesis, and then your call to action. And that should get you to like 800 words. If you feel like you're having trouble coming up with enough evidence, you might want to look back at your thesis and think of ways that you can expand, or like just draw, or not draw out like what you want to really say. Okay, so that was kind of, I have a slide on like where you can get started, but I'm gonna pause here to see if anyone has questions. If anyone has op-ed ideas that they want to drop in the chat that I can like talk out really quickly. Otherwise I'll keep going. Oh, I see. So I see a question. Um, when we pitch, do we need to have only a pitch or the entire story written? So it depends on the publication, but um, generally, like for if you're pitching to, if you're pitching to like the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the Richmond Times, like they have specific sections on their websites that are like op-ed or like op-ed submission or editorial submission. And they will say like they'll have a space either for you to copy paste your op-ed or they'll give you specific directions. But generally you should for op-eds have a draft done because it's a little bit less like a reported piece where like you can pitch a reported piece to an editor and then do the reporting and the interviews and all of that and put the piece together. Op-eds are like your opinion and you're really like trying to sell them on that piece. So most of the time you will have to have a finished one done, but it also depends on the outlet. So I definitely recommend going to like the op-ed page or the submissions page to see like whether or not you're gonna have to have a full one written. I always encourage you to have it written because more often than not, like most of them I think require like that draft and then they'll work with you on it. I love the reproductive one. That's a really important topic. Um, yeah, feel free to drop questions into the chat. I'm gonna just go on to the next slide really quickly. When it comes to like, and this kind of goes into what I was just talking about when it comes to the outlets, but how and where to start with op-eds, you should be looking for underreported angles or perspectives, things that you don't that aren't already out there. Like there's a million op-eds on the current president. What's new? What's underreported? What type of perspective do you have to offer? And this is where your unique perspective comes in, and that's why I kind of urged everyone to think of like what they bring to the table because that's really going to help set your op-ed apart and make it really attractive to publish. Also drawing from your experience, so like I said, personal stories can add a lot of credibility, a lot of originality. Um, so think of like any unique story you've had. I remember I read an op-ed about I think it was about like immigration and it was about a story. It was in our school paper in college and it was a student who was on a student visa. And so they had that kind of unique perspective to then write about immigration. Also, reading, so I know I keep saying this, but reading strong op-eds in target publications, so publications that you wanna write for, is really crucial. You don't wanna be, like, off their voice because a lot of publications have a voice. For example, Teen Vogue, uh, I love Teen Vogue, I love their politics coverage, but they have a voice. They really focus on young people, on issues that are underreported, and on politics and how that interacts with young people's day-to-day lives. So if your op-ed is more towards, like maybe an older demographic, which like I don't really anticipate happening, Teen Vogue might not be the place for it. So you really want to think about like who your demographic is and what publication you ideally would want to write for, so you can kind of think about what your voice should be. I'm not saying you should change your voice completely. I'm just saying like when it comes to thinking of your audience, that should be reflected in your op-ed. So when it comes to where to start, if you don't have a lot of writing experience, which is totally fine. I mean, anyone can write an op-ed, and that's the best thing about them is they're really accessible forms of advocacy. Um, you start at your university or your high school outlet, write for your school paper, write an op-ed, see how you can get that published and like work your way up from there because you want to have some form of experience, you want to be able to practice your writing. That's always a really good way to start. And then going to local news outlets. So maybe your county has a local news outlet. Um, maybe you have an area-wide newspaper, or a digital news site. That's always also a really good way to start if you feel comfortable with like your writing experience, but maybe not as comfortable when it comes to like large outlets. Um, and then if you feel like you have enough clips, maybe you're already editor of your school paper and you're ready to take it to the next level. Large outlets that are regional are always a good stepping stone. So the LA Times, Boston Globe, these are all huge, huge like regional papers that I think are really they do really great journalism and they're really uh, extensive op-ed sections that students can contribute to. So, like I know with Boston Globe, they have tons and tons of college students that write for them, or for their opinions page, but also just in general. I wrote one of my first op-eds ever in like the Richmond Times, so that gives you an idea. Like these large outlets are definitely like a good way to reach people. I actually like wrote something in the Richmond Times and had someone email me saying like they read it and they were a former student journalist. Like it reaches really cool and interesting demographics, and so definitely something to consider. And then if you then feel like you've collected a lot of clips, you have a lot of writing experience under your belt, um, I definitely recommend then going to like national outlets. Granted, I think in like this political climate, it might be depending on like the type of article you want to write. If you're writing about like student press freedom, it might need to be pegged to like a news outlet, not news outlet, a news topic or like a current event for the national outlet to maybe want to consider it more. But that's just because of the amount of news that's just ongoing these days. But that said, like places like the Washington Post, um, I think like The Hill is an example, Teen Vogue, like they all have published young writers before. They've all published SPLC writers before, people who've written about student press freedom. So I think those are all really important to consider as well. But I obviously like I'm not going to say like you're definitely going to get published in a national outlet because it's really important to build up those skills first. And so that's why there's little stepping stones that you can kind of align yourself with based on how comfortable you are with your writing experience. Um, but yeah, so with that, I we can do questions at the end. Josh, if you want to kind of touch on the next two slides.
Yeah, thank you, Pratika. So, as Pratika mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different ways that you can advocate for student press freedom specifically. Um, and we have an event tomorrow night called New Voices and Beyond that will talk about a few of those ways that you can get involved in advocating for student press freedom. And particularly the New Voices movement, which is about passing state laws that kind of put restrictions in place about the kinds of censorship that student journalists can face at the high school level in particular, but some of those laws also affect college journalists. So if you're interested in learning more about New Voices, or just the ways of advocating for student press freedom more generally. I really encourage you to join us tomorrow for that event. You can register at studentpressfreedom.org/events. And then if you want to go to the next slide, we have a lot other resources on studentpressfreedom.org as well, including some talking points about student press freedom, which might be helpful if you're wanting to write an op-ed about this topic. And we have social media toolkits in case you want to share out your own story about press freedom. And then we have resources like 50 Ways to Celebrate Student Press Freedom Day to kind of help you brainstorm other ways that you might want to get involved if you're thinking about doing so outside of writing op-eds or editorials.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening. I hope that this was helpful or inspiring in some way, shape, or form to write op-eds about student press freedom, student journalism, to use your student journalism skills to write op-eds and share your perspective on issues that matter to you. I'm happy to answer any questions right now. But if not, I'll throw my email in the chat right now, and you can feel free to email me if you don't feel comfortable or maybe you just want to think about it a little bit. I'm happy to help with op-eds, especially related to student press freedom because Student Press Freedom Day is coming up and we definitely want to have some op-eds out there. So whether that's for your school paper, your local paper, whatever, I am happy to help.
Terrific. So any last questions for Pratika before we wrap up? And Pratika, I think that I'm not sure that everyone got that, so I'm going to reshare your email just to make sure that everyone can see that. And as I mentioned, a lot of resources are available on studentpressfreedom.org. And then SPLC's website is splc.org. All right. Seems like
Excellent.
everyone has their questions answered. You did such a good job, Pratika, that everyone's ready to get to writing.
Yes, please write about student press freedom. Such an important, timely topic. So can't wait to read all of them.
Yeah, and please share them with us. I'm sure Pratika would love to see anything that you write based on what you've learned tonight. Tag, like I said earlier, tag SPLC, make sure that we can see it. We'd love to share it and make sure that more people read what you have to say. So be sure to let us in on all of that. Great. Pratika, any last words that you'd like to share?
No, I mean, happy Student Press Freedom Day. Please tune in to all the events. SPLC has so many ways to get involved, so I definitely encourage everyone to, no matter where you are. But thanks for joining. I hope I was helpful.